Welcome back to a new episode of Gaming Origins. Today we're looking at one of the series Rare is most well known for, Banjo-Kazooie. Banjo-Kazooie started out as a very different game than the finished product. Originally codenamed Project Dream, the game began development after the fantastic Donkey Kong Country and was intended to be an action role-playing game for the Super Nintendo and later on the Nintendo 64. The story revolved around a boy called Edison who was up against a gang of pirates and their leader, Captain Black-Eye. We don't know a great deal about this cancelled game, and only a couple of years ago did we get any footage along with one of the possible titles for the game, Dream Land of Giants. Originally with the idea of being a SNES game, Rare found the game was too large for the console and turned to the N64, which was much more powerful. However, a year into development and the project was scrapped altogether due to concerns of its quality. Interestingly, Banjo was indeed a character in Project Dream, however only a secondary one instead of what would be the main character of what the project would eventually become, Banjo-Kazooie. Development of Banjo-Kazooie began in 1997 with Super Mario 64's world being a major inspiration for the team. Wanted to produce something similar, except with the appearance of Donkey Kong Country. Originally the game featured just Banjo, with Kazooie added later into development in order to incorporate some of the abilities they wanted to add, like sprinting where Kazooie takes over. Banjo-Kazooie finally released in the middle of 1998 for Nintendo 64 after a year of dev time to great success. Set in a place known as Spiral Mountain, Banjo, a honey bear, and his companion that rests in his backpack, Kazooie, a Breegull, are on an adventure against a witch known as Gruntilda. Gruntilda is told by her cauldron that Banjo's sister Tooty is more beautiful than her. Angered by this, she creates a machine that can transfer her beauty from one person to another and manages to abduct Tooty. Banjo, upon realising she's been taken, heads out on the journey to save his sister. The game world is very open with plenty of collectibles in the form of Jiggies and musical notes. Jiggies are essential to progressing in the game, but the more you collect, the more worlds you'll have access to. Banjo and Kazooie have a number of abilities you'll need for obstacles or to defeat enemies. They can jump, climb, swim, and even fly short distances. All characters in the game have a voice, although they don't speak their dialogue, but instead a form of inaudible mumbling. Rare introduced this as they believed it was a way to show their personalities, but without actually speaking, which they thought might ruin the player's perception of the characters. The game was received extremely well, with a Metacritic of 92%, with some reviewers calling it more complex, more fluid, and a more attractive game than even Super Mario 64. Rare wasted absolutely no time developing a sequel, starting in the same year as Banjo-Kazooie released. The game would launch at the end of the year 2000 in the US and in early 2001 for Europe, once again for the Nintendo 64. At the end of the original, Banjo and Kazooie defeat Gruntilda, trapping her under a rock. The beginning of the sequel sees her sisters free her, although her time underground isn't without consequence, as surprisingly Gruntilda's flesh has rotted away, leaving her as purely a skeleton. In typical villain fashion, she seeks revenge and ends up killing Bottles, one of Banjo's friends, once again setting Banjo and Kazooie on another adventure to take down Gruntilda. Some of the work that never made it into the first game was transferred to the sequel, such as some of the worlds and a multiplayer mode where you could play with up to 4 people in the various minigames seen in the single player. An additional feature was scrapped where you could play as a ghost form of Bottles, taking over various enemies, but was left out due to time constraints. The game was graphically better than the first, featured more playable characters, and made the worlds feel more seamless by being directly connected together. When it comes to the collectibles, both Jiggies and musical notes still exist, although musical notes are now used as currency for learning new abilities this time around. The sequel scored similarly to the first with a Metacritic of 90% and sold over 3 million copies. A couple of years later, and a Banjo game was released on the Game Boy Advance called Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge, which as the name suggests is a continuation on from the previous games, set just 2 months after Banjo-Kazooie. Interestingly, the game was the first Banjo game to be released after Microsoft acquired Rare the year prior, who of course was previously owned by Nintendo. The game still launched on a Nintendo console, as Microsoft had no competing portable hardware to release it on. The game began development in 1999 as a Game Boy Color game under the name Grunty's Curse and featured a different story to the one we ended up getting, and originally had a flight concept that was scrapped. The plot begins with Gruntilda still trapped underground. Her henchman Klungo creates a machine body which she is able to inhabit as a spirit and once again tries to take revenge. She kidnaps Kazooie and goes back in time by 20 years in an attempt to stop Banjo and Kazooie ever meeting. The game scored a respectable 72% on Metacritic and managed to capture the Banjo and Kazooie gameplay despite the limitations of the hardware compared to the Nintendo 64. In 2005, we received another Game Boy Advance game called Banjo Pilot that deviated away from the core gameplay of the series. Banjo Pilot was originally going to be called Diddy Kong Pilot and intended as a sequel to Diddy Kong Racing. However, due to Microsoft acquiring Rare, many of the characters had to be changed, and therefore the game was altered to revolving around purely Banjo-Kazooie characters. The game feels very similar to Mario Kart and Diddy Kong Racing. You pick up various items through each course to damage or impede other racers to try and take the lead. The game featured a number of modes like Grand Prix, time trials, and also a multiplayer mode with 4 players that added some longevity. Banjo Pilot scored a rather mediocre 68% on Metacritic and the lowest scoring game in the series, mostly criticised for being rather average and posing no real challenge, although some critics like IGN said it was the second best racer on the Game Boy Advance. Another 3 years and finally the fanbase got a new title, this time on the Xbox 360, however it wasn't the Banjo game many were hoping for. The original teaser for the game led many to believe it was a traditional Banjo game, and Rare even had the idea of remaking the original. However, when the game was fully announced, it was very different from the game that was expected. Banjo-Kazooie nuts and bolts at its core revolves around vehicle construction and using those vehicles for various different challenges. There was a hub world where you would move around as Banjo-Kazooie with some platforming elements like a more traditional game, however an extremely large portion of the game surrounded vehicle creation and the use of them. The story takes place 8 years after Banjo-Tooie where Gruntilda's body was destroyed, however she still persists in trying to get back at the duo even as just ahead. The last few years haven't been kind to Banjo and Kazooie, who have become quite overweight after eating and playing too many video games. Before Banjo and Gruntilda enter into a fight, they're interrupted by the Lord of Games, who wants to settle their conflicts with challenges he will set. Graphically, Nuts and Bolts looked really good, and the game itself was reasonably decent. It just wasn't really a Banjo-Kazooie game, sadly, which is largely why it gets a lot of negativity. The game did score pretty well with 79%, with many critics noting that the vehicle customization was well done, but strayed too far from what people expect from a Banjo-Kazooie game. It's been 9 years since the release of the last game, despite fan wishes for Banjo 3, however the first 2 games and Nuts and Bolts were made playable on the Xbox One in 2015 with the release of Rare Replay, a collection of many Rare games in one package. The Rare of today are tackling Sea of Thieves due to release early next year, which so far looks like their most promising game in a long time. However, many of the Rare team that created Banjo are no longer with the company anymore. Many that did form their own company, Playtonic Games, that created a spiritual successor, Yooka-Laylee, that attempted to be a Banjo-like game. The game received massive funding on Kickstarter, but received mixed reviews upon release early this year. Would you like Microsoft to allow Rare to create a Banjo 3 at some point in the future, and do you think it will ever happen after waiting for so long? Let me know down in the comments. That's it for the first season of Gaming Origins. I hope you liked the episode. If you did, be sure to leave a like and sub, and follow Project Gamer on Twitter for channel updates. Click the thumbnail on the left for the last episode on God of War, and the one on the right for another of my videos. Thanks for watching as usual, and I'll see you on the next video.